welcome back to another episode of Death in Cambodia, Life in America. It is your host, Dorothy, and I'm here with another amazing interviewee. I am so excited to have him on the podcast. His name is Dr. Scott A. Allen. He is many things, people. I mean, his bio can truly go on. He is such an accomplished man. He is a physician, a professor at UC Riverside, internationally recognized in the field of health and human rights. He received the Ridenauer Prize for Physicians and Human Rights Award. He is also the co-founder of the Center for Health and Justice Transformation and the founder and medical director of the Access Clinic, which is located in Riverside. Back in the day, he was a relief worker at the Minute refugee camp. And then after that, he also worked as a resettlement worker for the U.S. Embassy. So I think that his perspective here is going to be really, really insightful, considering that at the age of 17, he went to the Khmer Rouge camps in 1980 and really, in his new book, described exactly what he experienced. His new book, and the very first of his, Across a Bridge of Fire. And we are so excited to have him on to discuss. So, Dr. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm so honored to be with you today.
We're so happy to have you. So, Scott, this book, I think, is a very, very necessary book for our generation. I mean, even as I was doing my research on the life post Khmer Rouge, right around the camp era of like 1980s, 1981 too, there are very, very limited firsthand experiences kind of condensed in a book form like this that goes into the detail of exactly what that whole experience was like, especially from someone who is an American and being dropped right in the middle of all of that. So going back to the very, very beginning, you had experienced a very traumatic burn in your childhood, which we had kind of discussed before this interview had started, definitely kind of set a foundation to how meaningful this experience was for you. Briefly, can you tell our listeners just about a little bit about that burn and how that led into you writing a letter to your parents that you were dipping to Thailand and helping people in Cambodia?
Yes. So it does all start with an accident that I suffered at age 10 through a very common mechanism of childhood burns. My brother and I were using gasoline to help light a campfire, and the can exploded. And I was burned, full thickness burns over about a third of my body, and spent an extensive period of time in hospital for burns, including at the Shriners Burn Institute in Boston. Surviving that, and particularly the Shriners experience of being hospitalized with other severely burned children, rocked my world in so many ways, aged me prematurely. For a 10-year-old, I was confronting issues of death, extreme suffering, sort of perceived lack of justice in this world, that when you see babies who have been burned, that's a lot to try to process at that young age. And I can also point out that was in an era, we're talking 1972, that the whole concept of trauma and how it affects children was, really not very advanced. So even at the best centers, pediatric centers for burns, there wasn't a whole lot of mental health support or by today's standards. And so when I returned back to sort of normal life, I always felt disjointed, that things that I was living among people who didn't understand how much suffering there was in the world. We live in the TV era in that period. The Vietnam War is constantly on the television. Even as a little kid, I'm looking at it and going, wow, that stuff is real. And even though those people look different than me and they're far away, I'm saying, no, I believe there are people out there suffering like this. So that was sort of the setup of what was going on. And so by the time I'm 17, and the story of the Cambodians arriving en masse on the border in October of 1979 is the headline news. It's all I needed to see to make the decision that I need to get there somehow. I had no illusions that I had skills or great gifts, but I just felt like it's where I needed to be. I couldn't sort of suppress that side of me that was concerned about suffering in the world any longer, even though I knew I was young, unskilled, and really didn't have any, particular talent to offer.
Right. Even at that young age of 17, did you notice kind of personality traits of being an activist? Or were you always super passionate about problems of the world? Because let's be honest, if it's not every 17-year-old that would be that passionate. I mean, we can even talk about consider the issues of the world today and
Right.
what's happening. And it's very, very rare, I would say, for a 17-year-old to kind of jump up, pack his bags, know that that is something that he's called to do to go out. I mean, has it always been something in your personality, or did it really feel rare?
No, I mean, I felt like none of my friends, and I should stop to point out here, no broken family story here, no lack of friends. I was very popular in my high school, supported by my friends, supported by my family. But when I tried to talk to them as I was responding to this news coverage of what was going on in the Cambodian border in Thailand, I felt like they just were like maybe typical people were that, oh, isn't that sad? But, what are we doing next? Or, you know, no one really related to it in a human way, which I understand. It's so hard to comprehend that level of suffering if you have nothing to connect it to. So I knew that my interest in it was atypical, but I also had a sense on why I was interested. I mean, I did have self-insight into that. I knew this had everything to do with everything I'd gone through in the burn hospital and the aftermath. And I felt like I saw things or could relate to things in ways my peers just weren't. And that's not a criticism. It is what it is. And I'm glad you're tying it to current events. If this story has any relevance, it's that these things keep happening. I agree with you. You will look at Gaza, you look at Ukraine, you can, Afghanistan, you can go on and on. This is a story that keeps repeating. And I think it's normal for people not to be able to connect to it, where, for now 44 years, I've been saying as loud as I can, no, these are real people. They're just like you and me. And the suffering is overwhelming. Like, we can't not respond. So we have to do whatever we can.
Yeah, yeah. So you truly did feel like that burn in your childhood, and the trauma that kind of followed along with it allowed you a different portal of empathy, I guess we can call it,
I
that
agree with
maybe
that.
other people weren't experiencing. How was the Khmer Rouge being shown in the media at that time? And do you believe that media was doing it justice?
Well, that's a great question. I do look back, and I actually still have copies of the key magazine articles. It was a Time magazine issue from October 1979 called Death Watch in Cambodia. I go back
Mm,
and read that article, and I think it was really well written. The other really important piece of coverage in that period was the New York Times magazine had Sidney Schamberg's The Death and Life of Dith Pran, the story
mhm,
that gave rise to the movie The Killing Fields. Those
right.
are two of the first things I read. And all these years later, considering what mass media is like and how it does slightly oversimplify things, I think they captured the essence of that moment fairly well. There's a mountain, not big enough, but there is a mountain of scholarship into all the subtleties and the nuances of that war, the Vietnam War, the spillover into Cambodia, the overthrow of the Lon Nol regime, the Sihanouk regime by Lon Nol, and then the rise of the Khmer Rouge, and then the whole Khmer Rouge period until the Vietnamese invasion. History you've talked about on this podcast extensively. There are broad strokes ways of telling that story, but what I love about what you're doing is there's very nuanced ways. As a early Cambodian friend of mine said, when I asked him, how do you feel about the fact that there were people who were Khmer Rouge who managed to conceal that when they interviewed for resettlement in the U.S., and they're living among you? How do you feel about having Khmer Rouge among your expatriate Cambodian community? And he looked at me and he said, it was a mess. It was a mess. I have to judge everyone individually, and I have to
Hmm.
hear their story, right?
Right,
Because as you know, are you
right.
Khmer Rouge because you lived in a rural village that was controlled by Khmer Rouge? Like you had no, but you're considered politically Khmer Rouge. Are
Hmm.
you Khmer Rouge that supported the idea of resisting the people who were bombing the country, that then being the Lon Nol aligned U.S. Government and Lon Nol associations? Or were you the truly evil people that ultimately, had power and did historically horrific things? It really matters, your individual story. Where were you? Who were you? And it's a very messy history. The Khmer Rouge, the sort of the top level people and the soldiers who really executed their radical extreme plans. No, I have no problem saying among history's most horrible people. But, as I got to know individual refugees, everyone's story was much more complicated than
Sure.
a sort of black and white. I think I've heard you say that in the podcast too, that you do believe, I share your belief, people are fundamentally good, but sometimes extreme situations drive them to do extreme things, good and bad.
Right, right. So it was being well portrayed in America at that time, and I'm glad it was. I wasn't there, but I can see how then, especially with like the media showing the attention that it deserved and telling people just kind of the horrific things that are happening over there. You're watching this, you're saying, "Wow, this is actually happening. I want to do something." You start off this book with the letter that you left with your parents to tell them that I am leaving to help the situation. You knew that they were going to be angry and you took off. And what was, if you can recall, kind of the first thing that went through your mind when you landed? I think not necessarily in Thailand, but when you saw the camps for the first time.
Yeah. So just to briefly connect those moments from landing in Thailand, as I describe in the book, not knowing a thing about Thailand. I mean, I only
Hmm.
half jokingly tell people if I got off the plane and everyone was, say, black, like Africans,
Hmm.
I wouldn't have known what to expect. I would say, oh, whatever. I knew
That's the way it
nothing
is.
of
Yeah.
Thailand. I knew only these brief articles I had read about the Cambodians, knew something about Vietnam just through the perspective of American involvement in the Vietnam War from press. But I don't know anything about Thailand. I get off the plane and that's all in the book, scramble to try to make connections with people in relief agencies. But within a week, because it was such a chaotic period, I'm being put on a van with a small team and being sent to the southernmost camp on the Thai-Cambodian border called My Route. My route camp was in Trat province, which is the southernmost province along that Thai-Cambodian border, on a very narrow strip. If you look on the map, Thailand starts to thin out as it goes down, and
Mm.
it's really at the end, the mountains between Thailand and Cambodia, they start to come very close to the beach, but that is the border. The mountain is the border. And so as you get down to where my route camp is, you've got the mountains, which were occupied largely by Khmer Rouge, right behind them, Vietnamese forces at that time,
Mhm,
Thai
mhm.
forces sandwiched on the other side, and on this narrow little precarious strip, my route camp. Now, compared to what you've known and seen of camps, my route was unique in that most of the camps I think you and others are familiar with are the larger camps further up on the border in very different geography. So the first thing
Mm,
that strikes me about my route camp is it's on a beach. It's a little over the bluff, so you're not like right looking at the ocean, but you can walk over that little bluff. The refugees couldn't because it was beyond the barbed wire. And then the mountains behind it. But the camp itself, the bamboo structures were built on white sand. Now think of, pictures you've seen of Khao Dang or the Kamput or the other camps on the border. Very different look, not in the middle of the woods or the jungle, not in the middle of a rice field, just on a beach. So was not expecting that. The other thing that initially struck me as I walked into the camp, as I suppose, like many people, I expected to find that the people were exhausted and despondent and, in a desperate way. And mind you, many of them were still malnourished, very unhealthy, and many had much still to worry about. But what immediately struck me within the first moments of entering the camp and my first interactions with the first Cambodians I would interact with was their sense of hope and their sense of resilience. Man, it just hit me in the face. And because I wasn't expecting it, it really amazed me.
And at that point, when you had stepped into the camp, you feel like you had a pretty in-depth knowledge of the Khmer Rouge, of what exactly had been happening in the past 4 years, or was it just more bits and pieces that you had picked up from media?
Really, having complimented the press coverage, and I also did want to add, having complimented the early press coverage, I hasten to point out that it didn't last long. The Cambodian story dominated the headlines for about 4 or 5 months, and then it was off the front page, knocked off by other events. So that was also discouraging to see because, as you know, the refugee problem on the border went on at least for another decade.
Exactly.
And those early years, it was still touch and go for several years. So, no, I had only the most rudimentary knowledge. Now, I should also point out, while we're picturing this camp that's on the beach on the southernmost part of the border, it actually was a collection of several camps, and it's probably worth pausing to describe the two camps. One camp that had wooden barracks that had been there since 1977 or 1978 was the Khmer Rouge camp. Now, you might wonder, what's a Khmer Rouge camp dating back to 1977 or 1978? What does that have to do with the story? The Khmer Rouge weren't overthrown until the Vietnamese invaded in late 1978 and displaced on to the border in 1979. So what is there? What is there a refugee camp? Well, it goes back to what we were talking about before. The Khmer Rouge are not a monolith. I mean, as much as they were centralized control and it was very controlled, as your father describes so poignantly in his account. And yet there were many different factions, and they would turn on each other, and there were party purges that were quite ruthless, and people were killed. So this original camp was housing refugees who fled in 1977-78. Khmer Rouge, still loyal to the concept of the communist revolution, but on the outs with the leaders in power. So this Khmer Rouge camp, even though they've been there in the refugee camp for 2 or 3 years, they're still wearing their black pajamas and their tire shoes, and they tend to have been rural, uneducated people. And particularly the men in that camp wanted nothing to do with me. They would stare at me with suspicion. Some of the women would talk to me briefly. But when I was not primarily assigned to that camp, but I did spend some time in it and would certainly go by it and go into it, that was really humbling. I mean, that camp scared me. Across the sand and in another barbed wire compound was what was called the new camp. And the new camp was made up of non-Khmer Rouge people who were very much the victims of the Khmer Rouge. But here they were housed in barbed wire looking across the sand at people that looked to them like the people who had tormented and tortured them for the previous years. So they were very uncomfortable with that. The new camp, which is where I meet my new friends and where I spend most of my time, people have discarded as quickly as they could their black pajamas and the tire sandals, that whole, and the kramas, the checkered kramas that you often see in the pictures. They couldn't get rid of that stuff fast enough and quickly donned clothes that were donated by the international agencies. And were trying to dress again in Western ways, or the women would have colorful sarong, or in a top in the more traditional way. But definitely, no one in that camp was wearing black.
Yeah, yeah. So you go into this area with, kind of several camps in the same vicinity as a relief worker on the field at 17 years old, and you go in. Can you explain to me a little bit of the dynamics of the refugees looking at you as a white guy from America, the hope that they look to you for, and I would imagine kind of the reaction that you would have to that being only 17 years old and yet coming in here and trying to help. What responsibility did you feel like you had, and what did that make you feel like?
Well, the quickest and most succinct answer: overwhelmed. Number one, I hadn't figured out what I was going to do. That didn't stop everyone from immediately glomming onto me with great expectations of our hopes on what I could do. And you're correct. There were two Americans already there in the camp working on the old camp side. They were Thai Baptist missionaries. On the new camp, you are correct. There at the time, the embassy wasn't allowed in those camps. So you had international workers, but from Europe and from Asia. Our team arrived. We were really one of the first small American teams. And I should point out, most of my team at that point was four Catholic nuns in their 60s from New York City who had never been overseas. And they kind of huddled in the little section they were assigned. They were going to build a sewing center for the women. Because I had no assigned duties, I immediately kind of started wandering into the camp and interacting with the people. So yes, this was a camp that largely on a day-to-day basis, the residents of that camp mostly saw Thai soldiers or UN workers who were often Thai as well. So I stood out like a sore thumb. And yes, not only was I 17, if you look at the pictures in the book, I was a young looking 17. I looked 14, and that wasn't lost on anybody. But it wasn't like there was a young guy and standing next to him, a 40-year-old white American. I don't think that mattered. As soon as they found out I was an American, I was from the outside. I was surrounded by a crowd. And almost every time I entered the camp for the next 3 months where I worked there, always had a crowd lingering around me. And that was overwhelming because there would be specific requests. Very common. I was approached with people's mail or valuables. Can you get this to my family in America? People would shove things into my hands. But the more overwhelming requests were just simply people wanted to tell their survival story. And you can imagine your experience. Well, not imagine. You have the experience of going through this detailed retelling of your father's story. And I know he's your father, so there's that extra emotional response. But I have a feeling if you were interviewing another Cambodian who's not your father, it's just a lot to process. And I was from right when I came through the door, I was starting to hear these stories. And people would say to me, let the outside world know what happened. Well, this is pre-internet. I can't blog on this, right? There's no internet. At best, I'm going to write letters that will take 2 weeks to get back to the United States. And I did write those letters and I did try to tell people, but they didn't go further than my family and, shared with some friends. It was a very frustrating thing, hoping the news media was doing a better job than I could do to get the story out. So that I felt responsible for that. And then last but not least, they all wanted to come to the United States or anywhere for that matter. They would have gone to Canada, Australia, France, the other countries that were offering resettlement. But people were constantly asking me to help them go to the United States.
Yeah, yeah. Not long after getting into the camp, you had bonded and had a connection with a small family, a woman and some of her children. And you kind of go and describe what their day-to-day is looking like and just kind of watching them. And I think that is a very unique experience as well, because my father, there's so many stories that are uncaptured there, but specifically from me interviewing my father, him being a man, I could only imagine the different kind of stories and the different level and severity that you had to experience if you were a woman. And not only that, but a woman with kids at that time. So can you shed a little bit of light on the difference between a woman with kids surviving something like that versus a man surviving something like the Khmer Rouge?
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. So we're now to the point where I start to connect with actually two Cambodian families, and I will jump to the end of the story. 44 years later, these families are my family. I'm their family. I mean, I'm as close to these two families as I am to my own blood, and our lives have been very intertwined now for 44 years. So they're literally the first people I meet in camp. So I'm walking through and nobody speaks any English. I don't speak a word of Khmer at that point. And I just bump into one gentleman. His name is Lee. And Lee does speak some English. He had, before the war, he had in Phnom Penh hung out with journalists in Phnom Penh and learned enough English that he knew I would need some help. He stepped forward and introduced himself. And he was there with his wife, Kolap, and they had paired up on the border in a jail with this widow, Tita, 32 years old, and her 7 children, the eldest being my age, all the way down to age 4.
Hmm.
7 children. I immediately became captivated by the mother of that family, Tita. I tell the story in the book, not for the least of which she was non-verbally bold and how she got my attention from the crowd of everyone who wanted my attention. She literally grabbed my hand and pulled me to her side and would not let go of my hand. So I had very complex emotional reaction in the moment to it. On the one hand, I was flattered and I was intrigued by her. But on the other hand, I felt like I felt trapped. I literally was trapped. But from the very beginning, there was something very special about Tita. And if you've read the book, you know Tita is probably one of the most important people I've met in my life. Sadly, she's since passed away. But here was a woman who had lost her husband, who had been a government official, an art, Khmer dance, and music teacher and administrator in Battambang in the school district in the province. And they were persecuted under the Khmer Rouge. And he eventually died of illness and starvation. You know, as your father tells the story, many parents making sure their children got the food. He had 7 kids, including his youngest, who in that period was a newborn baby up till age 4. So he sacrificed for his family and ultimately gave his life. And I have to point out, Tita was a beautiful woman, and her daughters, there are 4 of them, but 3 of them were teenagers. Very beautiful young woman. I mean, I could do the math in my head. I thought, like, you cannot be more vulnerable than this in terms of exploitation. And you've talked about it in your podcast and other episodes. At times like this, where there are great power imbalances, where there are social grievances and so forth, sexual violence is a major issue. I have to say, 44 years later, details of any sexual violence against my Cambodian family, I have never heard it specifically. And I haven't asked. I think you get where I'm going. It's for them if ever they want to volunteer that, if they were so victimized. I don't need them to, and there's a more detail on that on the Vietnamese side where the sexual assault was well documented by international authorities. I don't need to hear a specific story to know that sexual exploitation by Khmer Rouge, very likely by Thai soldiers. You know, a lot of the Thai soldiers on the border were not the most professional. The professional army was manning the security, but if you got assigned to the camps, there was a unit called Task Force 80 that was sort of Thai irregulars, and you often got assigned to Task Force 80. You know, if you got into minor trouble with the law, they might say, well, you can go to jail or you can put on a uniform and go serve on the Cambodian border. So, you know, not the best of the best. Yep. So, yeah, I think sexual violence was always real, present danger. And you could look at someone like Tita and her girls, her older girls in particular, and say, oh, my God, they are really at risk. And without a man, the father no longer being alive, who's protecting them from this? I think, you know, Lee, to be honest with you, was actually doing the best he could. That's why I think he took them under wing too. He is a fellow refugee. He had concerns about their.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned that after a certain point of staying in the camps and sleeping there, you just decided that you were more comfortable actually sleeping in the camps, right, Scott? And I wonder when you made that decision, if a piece of you did kind of feel that your presence alongside them would be protecting them because you are male.
Well, you know, it's funny that you say that. One of the excuses, the American who hired me in Bangkok hired me as a volunteer and sent me out to the border, rationalized, just to make me feel better, that the team he was sending out was just these older nuns, Catholic nuns from New York. And they were a little concerned that they're being sent out, this initial team, as 4 women and no men. And they were concerned about their security too. And when I got there, actually, there were also 2 nurses from Austria. And one of the older Austrian nurses looked at me and said, we asked our agency to send out a man for our team, and they send out a kid, this boy.
Yeah, I remember
Um,
that.
so similarly, I don't think I had any illusions that I offered much protection, but yes, I did know that by my bonding and connecting to these two families, I was affording them some protection. Yeah, there's a reality to that.
As people, yeah, I mean, previously you had mentioned that people were coming to you with their stories, telling you, urging you to share what had happened. Was there a story that you had heard that you just could not shake from the survivors? What was the heaviest story that you had to hold?
That's a tough one because I don't think there was a story I heard that wasn't overwhelming. And I think it was a cumulative effect of all of them. There was a commonality. And I think as you do your interviews, you have a sense of, how the Khmer Rouge emptied the cities, relocated the people to the countryside, targeted people who were educated and connected to the previous regime, the labor camps, so forth. But every story has its own individual path. And as you know, the way families were torn apart, I think really
Hmm.
was the part I learned in camp. What I read about in these accounts, I didn't realize how young the children were who were pulled
Hmm.
away. So you had the Gong Jalat, the mobile youth teams for teenagers, but also the Gong Kamar, which was the children, as you know, as young as 10, sometimes even younger, separated from
Right.
their families and sent off into these labor camps. To hear about that. And so in the family, Tita's family that I was getting to know, even within that family, they all have their own stories because the mom was with the 3 or 4 youngest children who were too young to work during that period. But the 3 eldest, and who are all daughters, they were sent not together, they were sent to different work teams. So they each had their own story. And I have to say, to this day, respecting and allowing them to tell their stories in their own time, I only know pieces of their stories, what they've chosen to reveal. And this is sounding familiar to you as your dad over time slowly revealed his full story. But the little pieces they hear, I mean, just the fact that they were separated from their family, in addition to what we all know is going on, the killing, the slave labor, the abuse, the starvation, the illness without infrastructure for medical care. Again, going back to the beginning where we started, I've survived a pediatric burn ward, but I've survived a pediatric burn ward with all sorts of help and support. Now I'm hearing about greater traumas to young people. So I think now that I'm answering it, now that we're talking about it, probably the trauma visited upon children really was tough to process. There was an orphanage a couple buildings down from where these families lived. And I also spent a lot of time in that orphanage. And the children in the orphanage, as sort of art therapy, would draw pictures of things they had seen. And so to have
Oh.
children draw these pictures, I still have some of them. You've maybe seen some of these from that period, but children drawing pictures of people having their necks sliced or being beaten with
Mhm.
bamboo sticks or shot. What's a 6 or 7 or 8 year old, 12-year old doing that kind of revelation?
Especially since your burn happened when you were kind of in a similar age, 8, 9, 10. Well, you were 10, but kind of seeing that difference between experiences, and yet the kids, something that used to be the most traumatic thing in your life and probably, still is to this day, yet you're looking at kids who are 2, 3 years younger than you and drawing these pictures of things that they've seen that are way
Yeah.
beyond horrific of what you had experienced. That must have been really humbling in a sense.
Oh,
And
absolutely. And I also want to add that they were the result of humans being evil to other humans. So that was another, like I got injured in an accident, and most of the kids I was with got injured in accidents. Not all of them, if you remember the book, but most of them.
mhm,
And so now to see this kind of suffering that's intentionally visited upon children, inflicted by others,
mhm.
wow. What does that do to your understanding of this world? So I went there looking for answers, and I got answers, and I was able to move forward. But at the same time, it also acquired a whole new level of baggage in terms of struggling to this day to understand a world that allows these types of things to happen and does so over and over again. But maybe switching to a more positive footing, really inspired to this day, as we talked about by the resilience and perseverance and optimism that I picked up on when I first entered the camp. Wow.
Right.
You talk about being humble. That really humbled me because I thought, wow, I've struggled just with my issues, but everything these people are struggling with is so, orders of magnitude greater. And look at the strength. That wasn't universal. There were definitely people in those camps who were like really broken down emotionally and really
Yeah.
struggling. But I'd have to say they were the exception rather than the rule. I do want to put a pin on the point that now, having lived and worked closely with the Cambodian community for 44 years, those who were strong and resilient in those moments in the camps, one by one, would all eventually have their emotional collapse and trauma come home to roost and struggle with that, even decades later, such is the nature of trauma. But in the moment, the strength and the optimism, that is the strength of the human spirit. And it's really something to see up close like that. I mean, I'll never forget that.
Right. So you're in this camp in Beirut for how long? And then how did that transition to your job as the resettlement worker for the U.S. Embassy?
So after about 3 months, and I mentioned that, the Cambodian story was in the headlines for maybe 2 or 3 months, sort of top of the headlines. Now we're into early 1980. That is when Fidel Castro in Cuba
Hmm.
decided to release undesirables from his point of view. He emptied out his jails and prisons and so forth and let people in a flotilla flee Cuba as refugees to the United States. So that was the Muriel boat lift of 1980. And suddenly, America, who did have some concern about the welfare of Cambodian refugees, that at least at the political level and at the leadership level, they did connect to American actions in Southeast Asia and felt some moral obligation. That suddenly is overwhelmed by refugees arriving on U.S. shores. And it
Mm.
literally impacted my agency because the guy who hired me, David Lewis, with no notice, was summoned back to the United States to oversee the Muriel boat lift resettlement out of Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. His Vietnamese aide came to the camp one day and we said, "Where's David?" And she said, "He's back in the United States and we're shutting down. You guys don't have a job." Now,
Mm.
here I've got 3 months to bond with my friends Lee and Kolop and Tita and her children. I'm really quite attached to them. 3 months doesn't seem long, but can you imagine 3 months of living in those situations under those
Yes.
circumstances? I mean, my bond was powerful and almost instantaneous. And I'm being told, like, you're not authorized to be here. You're going to get in a van tomorrow and you're gone, which sort of tore us apart. And they were horrified by this development too. And I told them, I got to leave and I don't know if I may have to go back to the United States. I don't have another job. I'm only in Thailand because I'm working. That led to my second period of looking for a job as a 17-year-old who hadn't graduated from high school and had no skills. Now, the one thing I had hustled to do in 3 months of living among the Khmer in that camp was I developed rudimentary spoken Khmer with my friends helping me. And the interesting thing about that unique period of time in history, in Thailand, owing to the Peace Corps, there were many Americans at the embassy who spoke Thai fluently. Owing to the
Mm.
Vietnam War, there were many Americans at the embassy who spoke Vietnam, having been trained in the military or otherwise. There was almost nobody at the embassy who spoke any Khmer when I knocked on their door looking for a job. Now, I'd knocked on the doors of all the other large voluntary agencies and, got what you'd expect. Like, how old are you? How'd you get here? No, we don't, we don't need you. But when I knocked on the door at the embassy and they're talking to me and they say, do you have any skills? And I say, well, I've been on the border for the last 3 months and I have some conversational Khmer. They said, oh, you do? The embassy hadn't been allowed on the border. I mean, I should clarify. Intelligence people were, military and intelligence Americans were on the border, but not the resettlement section, the refugee section. So that was
Mm.
kind of enough of a hook, combined again with some behind the scenes sympathy from older people who, in fact, one woman, now a lifelong and dear friend, Andrea Fowler, who had been out to the border in advance, sort of maybe just checking out the camps if they were ever allowed to resettle. She saw me in the camp and she asked, like, who's this kid? She was a mom. She had a son almost my age. She was like, who's this kid running around the camp? Who does he belong to? Who's watching out for him? And so behind the scenes, she encouraged them to hire me. And I go from being a relief worker overnight to a badge carrying U.S. Embassy resettlement worker. Now, my whole goal is to try to help my friends. And suddenly I work for the embassy in the section that processes refugees for resettlement in the United States. I thought I'd hit the gold mine. The only problem was Cambodians were not being processed off the border in any large number. I know from your dad's story that he got out in 1979. Very lucky, very small group of people in that category. So not only was your dad in the earliest groups, he was among a very small number of people that were processed out one by one. So any large scale processing of Khmer wouldn't happen until about August of 1980. And that's when the first group of people who had been identified by the UN as possibly having some connection, maybe relatives in the US, were brought to that processing camp, Chonburi at Panatnakhon. And although I spent my first months working in a Vietnamese camp because there was no Cambodian processing, I always made it clear to my refugee section, as soon as you start processing Khmer, I want to be in those camps.
Right, right. Can you tell us a little bit about the refugee resettlement process? I think that is a perspective that a lot of people had questions on because we, as the children, really only know the side of our parents.
Right.
And as you had listened to my father's story, my dad's like, I don't know. They just asked for my name, and then all of a sudden I was in the U.S. And so, from the survivor's perspective, they're not quite sure, and they're just trying to get out of the hell-torn country that they're fleeing. So,
Right.
can you give us a little bit about just logistics and what was the system that they had come up with in 1980, and what was the goal, and how did it really go down?
So there were really different stages of the program. So I'm glad you asked that. And I think that's what also confuses people. Like any chaotic situation, from month to month, things can change. But broadly speaking, there was a very early phase that your dad was in, where I think it was really down to a case-by-case ad hoc basis. The number of refugees who had crossed were small. They weren't getting a lot of attention by anybody. But some of the relief workers, the United Nations on the border, might have heard your dad's story and say, gosh, think of what this guy survived. We can't send him back. Maybe asked him, would you be willing to go be resettled in the West? And he would have expressed openness to that. And then by and by connected him with the embassy, and he was processed through with probably a very small group. Very quickly, though, the Thai government, who already had large numbers of Laotian refugees in the country since 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War and the communist takeover in Laos, also were having large numbers of Vietnamese boat refugees arriving in Thailand. And they, for cultural reasons, really didn't like Vietnamese in their country. And their priority for resettlement was, let's get these Vietnamese out of the country as quickly as possible. So the Vietnamese typically were processed by the embassy very quickly. But their concern on the Cambodian border was, boy, if we start telling people, if you make it to the border, you have a chance of going to the United States, France, Canada, they worried about that pulling people across the border, making a bad situation worse. So for quite a long time, they were resistant to allowing any processing. But when it was clear that the Cambodians who were coming to the border were so desperate, they were coming anyway. They're coming even just to get out.
Right.
That the United States and the United Nations were able to negotiate with the Thai and allow some of the initial processing. But the initial processing, again, was still small. So that summer of 1980, I'm called and told I can go start with a team that's starting to do the very first processing of any relatively larger numbers, so maybe several thousand Cambodians who had been identified through correspondence. And there, even though I say the embassy wasn't allowed on the border, refugees were sending letters to the embassy, and people at the embassy were opening, in the refugee section, were opening those letters. And if someone said, I have a brother in California, they would be part of like, oh, well, maybe this is a candidate, because family reunification has long been one of the priorities for refugee resettlement. Or people might write and say, hey, I worked for the embassy and, you guys left me. That'd be flagged as someone high priority. And in fact, for listeners who are interested in the book, I literally quote the resettlement priorities of the embassy at that time. There was a ranking system. So the first is ad hoc, small numbers, and later we start getting people who come out into, well, not any common, we start processing in larger numbers. But eventually, beyond where my book covers, but by the time we get to 1982, 1983, we start doing much larger processing, going into Khmer Rouge camp, Kamput camp, and then eventually the biggie Khao Dang, and processing almost everyone in the camp. I worked my last 2 years, 1984 and 1985. We largely emptied Khao Dang, which at its peak population, as you know, was 150,000 refugees. We emptied Kamput camp. We emptied Khmer Rouge camp, with most of the people being resettled to the United States. So, if you are children of Cambodian refugees in the United States, very likely you came through one of those camps, and very likely I or my colleagues sat across a table from your family and interviewed you as part of the process of coming to the United States. But I do also want to point out, in 1982, U.S. immigration, at the time, we call it ICE in the present day. It was INS then, Immigration and Naturalization Services. They pushed back strongly as they felt a lot of Cambodians were not political refugees, which they clearly were. They said they were economic refugees. They just wanted to come to the United States because it offered opportunity. And they said, by their reading of the Refugee Act, they weren't eligible. To the credit of my leaders and colleagues in the embassy and good politicians, there was a huge battle in the summer of 1982 over that. Are these economic refugees or political refugees? And the side that said they were political refugees won. That's what led to the large-scale resettlement of Cambodians and really gave birth to the Cambodian community as we know it today in the United States. So people should know that story too. There were champions, unsung names you probably will never know, but I know who they are, who worked together with sympathetic people in Congress and the administration to open the door.
Yeah. Well, my dad has said in our recordings that he knows that there was somebody out there pushing for him and for these refugees. He doesn't know who, but he knows that there were people who kept banging the door and saying, hey, 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 we need to get these people out. And he truly recognizes that if it weren't for those people, those unsung heroes, that many people would still be left in Khao Dang or wherever, or back in Cambodia, and in worse conditions than they are today. Would you say then that was your biggest pushback while working in the U.S. Embassy, or what was the biggest roadblock you experienced when you're trying to shuffle everybody from the camps to the U.S.?
Well, the first one is the Thai have to allow access, which was always an on and off switch. It wasn't a simple thing. That was always had to be negotiated. The second thing is the host countries have to allow slots. This is an issue that continues to this day in the United States. How many slots do we have to allow people who are fleeing persecution around the world to come as refugees, as opposed to other ways of coming to the United States, family reunification, and so forth? To this day, from reading my biography, I still work as a consultant with the Department of Homeland Security, and I still spend time in immigration detention centers in the United States. The debate still goes on. It's part of our politics. It's part of this presidential election. How many people should we let in? But then the work we did as caseworkers is we had to make the case for each individual family. Not broadly that the Cambodians are deserving of consideration, but in this particular family's case, here's why they have a well-founded fear of persecution or harm should they return to Cambodia and therefore are deserving of legal refugee status and resettlement in the United States. And, one felt a certain burden to do a good job documenting those claims so that when they were presented to the immigration officials, they would be approved. And because not everyone was.
Yeah. Sorry, I have so many questions in my head. I'm trying to figure out which one's most important. My dad talks about the sponsor that had sponsored him in Portland, Oregon. What was that sponsorship program, and was that something that was heavily leaned on?
Absolutely. In fact, it was required. So there's a term I think used in the book. It's an abbreviation in the refugee business of those days, VALAGs, voluntary agencies. And there was the relief work, the work of getting food and healthcare and clothes and shelter. to the refugees on the border to overcome the immediate threats to their safety and health. But then back in the United States, there's a network often of some of the same agencies that were involved in sponsorship for resettlement.
Hmm.
Immigration didn't want to pick you up and just drop you off at an airport as you arrived. Someone had to be ready to receive you on the other end. Now, even if you had family members, you still needed a voluntary agency sponsor. These are agencies like International Rescue Committee, the American Refugee Committee, United States Catholic Conference, the Lutheran Relief Services, a lot of them religious based, made arrangements or had contracts with the government to help sponsor refugees. The idea being, how could you possibly expect someone who's been plucked out of the whole Khmer Rouge story, maybe was themselves rural, certainly hasn't gone to school for years, if they were young, if they're older, had been living this sort of slave labor existence, and you're going to drop them in the United States. No, they need some support. So if you had family, it was family plus an agency. But as in the case of your father, they had a lot of volunteers of Americans who said, well, if you have Cambodians, or for that matter, Vietnamese or Laotians or Hmong coming to the United States, we'll help them. We'll help them find an apartment. When they get that apartment, we'll help them find furniture and clothes. We'll help them find a job. That was the idea of sponsorship. And so sponsorship was critical. You needed to get a sponsor. An advantage to those who had family in the United States, their family would go to an agency and in collaboration with the agency file a sponsorship. Much more difficult for the majority who had to just wait sort of for people to volunteer and were assigned somewhat at random, which meant, by the way, how did your father choose where he ended up? He didn't choose. It was chosen for him. So, people were resettled in various communities across the U.S., and then only through what we called secondary migration did they start gathering in these somewhat spontaneously in these communities that to this day, Long Beach, Lowell,
Hmm.
Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, the Minneapolis, the centers of Khmer. Those were not planned by the government. Those were after people got to North Dakota or South Carolina or Maine. They're writing to each other, and the ones in Long Beach are going, hey, Long Beach, it's a lot like Cambodia, the weather wise. And so, secondary migration, people started to gather and populations grew at certain centers. In Lowell, Massachusetts, it's very interesting. It was just some of the people, in fact, some of the people in the family that I talk about in the book got early jobs when there was a little bit of a boom early on in manufacturing and the tech sector in Lowell. And just by
Yeah.
word of mouth, they told friends in Southern California, hey, come out here, there's jobs. So that whole secondary migration thing is fascinating too. But the voluntary agencies and the sponsorships, these are really critical pieces. So I'm glad you asked about that.
Yeah. I remember my question, so I want to take it back a little bit.
Sure.
Just at the point where you mentioned the dynamics that you kind of had to negotiate with the Thai soldiers when you were resettling these people out of the camps. There is kind of missing part of history that I had learned about, and you had mentioned briefly in the book called Prefier
Mm-hmm.
and the incident that happened there. And I always like to shed light on that because I feel like it was something that I didn't know about until I was talking to my father and he said this one tiny little sentence that I was like, wait, what? What did you just say? And so for the listeners, if you follow me on Instagram, you know what Prefier is. But for the people who don't, Prefier was a very, very tragic incident where, correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, because you were there kind of in the time period, but Thai soldiers had loaded up a bunch of Cambodian Khmer Rouge refugees, telling them that it was going to take them to a resettlement place in Bangkok, but instead had drove them to the edge of a cliff and basically had to, they horrifically pushed them back to the side of Cambodia, which is on a cliff of a mountain. There is a documentary called Ghost Mountain out there and a book by James Tang, which is a second generation like me who had written about his father's recount of living that. But Scott, what was your knowledge of Prefier,
So I
that
first
whole
heard about
experience?
the forced repatriation at Privahir from my Cambodian friends. This incident of Prevahir hung over the border in those early days like a dark cloud. I've already said embassies were not, in that early period, permitted to come to the border. And in fact, on a day by day basis, there was talk that the Thai may just force everyone across the border. And it wasn't a theoretical threat. I've sort of glossed over something that you've talked with your father about, but my own new Cambodian friends had their own story. You didn't just walk across the border. You had to, number one, clear minefields, clear the Khmer Rouge units that were still operating on the border, the non-Khmer Rouge resistance, KPNLF and the Sihanouk loyalists. You had to clear the Thai soldiers. You had to clear the landmines. I mean, it was really quite perilous, even in this period, to get across the border. The Thai didn't want to let you in and would turn people back at gunpoint. But once you were there, the refugees were often told, well, fine, come here, get some food to eat, get a little healthier, but you're going back. They were told that on a regular basis. And no, we're not letting embassies in here. You're not going to the United States. You're going back. And in that incident that you speak of, you described accurately, this is known not only through first-person accounts, but in that period, well documented by Western journalists who happened to witness it. But refugees were gathered up on a border camp in fairly large number, and as you described, driven up the northern part of the Thai border, very inhospitable area, and yes, forced over a cliff at gunpoint into a minefield. And I don't think it's ever been accurately documented how many people perished in that forced repatriation, but it was absolutely a human rights violation. It was horrific. And, okay, I've already said pre-cell phone, pre-computer, but word of mouth, everyone on the border knew about Prevahir because enough of the survivors came back through Cambodia and made it back to the border. They knew that story. And we lived in abject fear that any day without notice, any of the camps could be emptied back across the border at gunpoint. So yeah, you're living with that kind, especially in those early days, you're living with that kind of fear and anxiety. And that's why the resilience and optimism did surprise me. I mean, simultaneous with knowing you could be thrown back into that pit of violence that you just fled, they're still finding hope and optimism. They at least made it to the razor's edge of the killing fields. Not safely out, not resettled to a third country yet, but the possibility exists. And when I listen to your father's story, he talks so much that sometimes just a glimmer of hope was enough for him to hold on to. That was, something that I saw over and over again. But don't let's gloss over the real and profound fear people had about forced repatriation, especially through 1981, maybe 1982, when it started. Then when this large scale resettlement starts to happen, I think then people are starting to feel a little more safe. The Thai were at that point much less likely to do something like that under the watchful gaze of a very large Western presence on the border by that point.
Yeah, yeah. So that happened, would you say, before the big agencies really kickstarted the resettlement in August?
That's right. That's right. It happened
Mm,
before.
yeah.
It sort of was, so you can imagine it was an early effort by the Thai to say, let's try to nip this in the bud. Let's try to shut this
Mm-hmm.
down. And they did it violently and they did it ruthlessly. And it didn't work, right? I mean, people still kept coming to the border. In fact, as much as the Thai were trying to keep people from crossing, I think, up until that Sakeo camp in the October flow of refugees, the biggest thing holding people who were trying to flee from coming into Thailand were the Khmer Rouge themselves, who were holding captive populations. The people,
Mm-hmm.
when the Khmer Rouge soldiers fled to the border, they took the people from the villages that they were, had enslaved and pulled them with them into these border camps. So that when Sakeo opened up in October 1979, those are the pictures to see where people are walking skeletons and people were arriving in the camp and collapsing and dying. And I wasn't there yet. That was several months before I arrived, but I have many colleagues and friends to this day who were there who tell really heartbreaking stories of how helpless they felt to respond to the large number of people who arrived in such terrible physical condition.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that only goes to show the power of the work that you have done, Scott, being able to be in the position that you were and as young as you were. but still having that initiative, that motivation to really fight for the people who were in those camps, who were surviving what I can say is hell on earth, from what I can hear from my father. And I know that there's so many listeners who are listening here that I can already just feel the gratefulness from them through this podcast. And as a community as a whole, from the second generation, and I know definitely from the voice of my father that your work was truly, truly life changing, and not only saved the families that you had spoken to, but the generations after. I mean, I myself would not be here today if my parents didn't survive. And what you have done is just is the most important work in our eyes. Looking back at your experience, what would you say is the biggest lesson you have learned?
I try to answer that question in the book. I think it's the importance of compassion, combined with the importance of hearing people's stories, which is why I so love what you have done with your podcast. If only the early seasons of capturing your father's survival story in the most emotionally impactful way. I think it's important, you know, these stories, as dramatic and profound as they are, they're forgotten so quickly, right? Because trauma stories, people don't want to tell them. I can relate to that. But it's still the story of how your family came here and what your family survived. And my hope in writing the book, we talk about the scale of trauma, mine versus the Cambodians being of different orders of magnitude. For years, I didn't think I should write my book because it paled in comparison to the Cambodian survival stories. But then it dawned on me that there was this gap in the story that I think you're focusing in on. The Cambodian American story is a Cambodian American story. I can tell you about one of the first Cambodian American relationships, of which, as you know, there are many, and also can tell the story from that perspective of someone from the outside who grew up in a land of safety and privilege, witnessing at the edge of the killing fields this overwhelming history, but compassion and the importance of learning this history for younger Khmer, but I don't care, not for Americans, period. It's relevant, as we've said already in our discussion, because in other parts of the world, people are undergoing extreme trauma, particularly when that trauma has any connection to things the U.S. has done as a government, as a military, as a people. That was certainly true in Cambodia. I still strongly believe there's a profound moral obligation to the people of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, as there is now to the people of Afghanistan. And you can go on and on. But as a humanist, I believe anyone who's traumatized deserves attention. But certainly, America owed a debt that it will never repay to the Cambodian people. And I'm happy to say 44 years later, the Cambodian people who came to the United States have contributed so much to the United States and our culture. I'm delighted to see second and third generation Khmer here thriving, doing well, making important contributions. It's a wonderful story to have witnessed.
Yes. Well, Scott, I appreciate your time here and your unique perspective on the story and the Khmer Rouge refugee experience. For anybody out there who wants to get a copy of your book, Across a Bridge of Fire, where can they find it and where can they find you?
They can find the book anywhere you find books. Obviously, Amazon. It's available both as an ebook and hardcover, softcover. But you can also order it through most independent bookstores. If you want to support your local independent bookstore, you can ask them to order it. They can order it through their network. You can find me at drscottallen.com. That's Dr. Scott Allen, SCOTTALLEN.com. More about me. And you can also reach out to me through that website as well.
Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, Scott, before, thank you so much. We're going to talk after this interview, but I am just saying a huge, huge thank you for the tremendous work that you have done throughout your lifetime. I mean, we've only focused on this one part of your life and where you've contributed to the Khmer Rouge refugees, but you have been continuing this work for the next 44 years post Khmer Rouge, and I truly can't thank you enough, especially from that time that you were working on the resettlements in the US Embassy. I can only imagine my listeners spinning their heads about the idea that maybe you had interviewed their parents when they were coming through. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here and being on the podcast.
Well, it's been a real honor, and I want to thank you again for the really important work you are doing. Please keep going with the podcast. Interview as many people as you can. We do need to preserve this history. You know, the generation that really survived the worst of it, they're getting older.
That's
Some
right.
of them have already passed. And more of the stories that you can capture, you're doing a huge service for future generations. So thank you.
Thank you so much.